Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Jake Valancourt. I am a co-founder and also responsible for technical sales. This is 10x Engineered Materials, and we have put together a really exciting webinar today to talk about safety and specifically address some concerns about beryllium. And I'm joined by our CEO, Dr. Stephen Ritchie. I will hand it off to him.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Ritchie, and Jake said I'm CEO of 10x, and I've had the honor of being here from the beginning. At first, 10x was just one of many ideas that we were trying to develop. But about 5 years ago, we introduced a new class of sustainable abrasive products that are made from the byproduct of mineral wool manufacturing. And in the beginning, we were trying to solve a major material repurposing problem. Owens Corning had hired a group of us, and we had a list of ideas that we were testing. But the idea of turning it into a blasting abrasive was one that just refused to fail. And when you're developing a new technology for commercialization, you want to fail as fast as you possibly can. It saves everybody a lot of time, money, and heartache. But aside from the remarkable and surprising performance of the material in those early tests, we also had to evaluate it for safety. Of all the reasons we might have chosen to go forward with this technology, safety was and still is by far the strongest reason. There has never been and probably never will be a safer blasting abrasive. We learned that mineral wool had been scrutinized in exposure studies, maybe more than any other material in history. There were huge human epidemiological studies. Tens of millions of dollars had been invested in gold standard animal exposure studies. And in the end, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified the material in group 3, which means that it's not classifiable as a human carcinogen. And that's a way bigger deal than most people understand. It was discovered in all this testing that the material actually dissolves and is cleared from your lungs like all other non-toxic dusts. Your lungs can take care of even extremely high dust level. That was tested. And we're also going to show you today how similar exposure tests of other abrasives should cause serious concern. We're going to talk a lot about beryllium. As we've taken market share over the past couple of years, some of our competitors have decided to try and slow us down by scaring the market into thinking that 10x is loaded with beryllium and will kill you if you get near it. Nothing could be further from the truth. Using 10x actually saves lives. We're going to show you in detail how they're misleading you into making decisions that could ultimately harm the workers that we all care deeply about. And I just want to point out that nothing we're going to say today or share is our opinion. It's all based on peer-reviewed, published information and the findings of global toxicological authorities. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about our story. Back in 2015, a group of geek friends and I, Jake among them, left our jobs to help Owens Corning find a way to repurpose mineral wool byproduct. This byproduct is the same material as the product, but it just doesn't make it out of the forming chamber. But to develop the idea of an abrasive, we had to figure out how to make it. And since we didn't have a lab, I used my garage to do what I'd done for over 20 years at the research institute I worked for. And that resulted in that godforsaken prototype that's in the top of the slide that we actually rolled up to Owens Corning to prove to them that we figured it out. At that point, we were in the proverbial valley of death. We needed to prove, to demonstrate that we could do it at full scale. And people don't tend to invest in an idea unless it's been proven at full scale. So we had to go and recruit some investors. And quite frankly, I wish I could introduce you to our investors. They just all set an example of goodness. And they support us because we're doing something meaningful. It's been 7 years and we've come a long way. And I can tell you, once our customers see the 10x magic and realize that the positive impact on their business dwarfs the cost of the abrasive, they never switch back. So we came into this industry as outsiders, and we're different because of it. We're primarily a group of engineers. We thrive on new and better ideas, and we want to do it in a way that improves people's lives and makes the world a more sustainable and better place. If you want to sum up our mission, that's what it is. The fact that our particles are formulated and produced in the mineral wool process is what gives them their unique advantages. By melting a specific blend of minerals and then spinning and rapidly cooling them makes a durable fiber that actually melts in your lungs, which we'll talk about. Every manufacturer in the world formulates for both material performance and lung solubility. But the spinning process also produces particles. It's unavoidable, but they're also durable. They're fracture resistant. We use those particles to make 10X abrasives. It's the same material as the mineral wool product. It's just in a particle form. It's actually safer than fibers, but this durability and impact strength makes the abrasive faster. It allows you to use less abrasive, sometimes a lot less abrasive. It leaves less surface residues after blasting, and it even delays rust bloom, which saves a ton of wasted time and money because you only have to blast once. And because fewer particles shatter on impact with the surface, and this is huge, worker exposure to dust is much lower than other mineral abrasives. And anyone who uses our abrasives knows this. We have 3 product lines. Kinetics is for high volume applications where you need that 2.5 to 3.5 mil profile. We just released Dynamics. It's designed for the tougher, heavier duty applications. It's more aggressive, more forgiving on the toughest coatings, and it leaves a higher profile. And Epics is our fine grades. They bring a combination of aggressiveness and then also the precise, uniform, pristine finish. Powder coaters love Epics. But to sum up the performance, the value of superoxide abrasives, I would ask you where on earth you can get these kinds of improvements without having to make a capital investment. This is why our customers don't switch back. And this is why our competitors are attacking us over safety. Their products can't do this. But the most important reason to use 10X abrasives is because tens of millions of dollars were invested in these human epidemiological and animal exposure studies over decades, all in an effort to prove that it doesn't cause lung diseases or cancer. 10X comes from the same process step as the mineral wool product. It's the same material in a particle form, and it's even less toxic than fiber dusts. There's no other abrasive manufacturer that can tell you that there is a monograph from the International Agency for Research on Cancer that removed their material from lists of possible human carcinogens worldwide. These are the tests that matter. These are the kinds of studies that toxicological authorities and regulators use to make decisions about the toxicity of materials and to set exposure limits. Mineral wool is regulated as a nuisance dust, and that's because it dissolves in the lungs and is quickly cleared, like other non-toxic dusts. And you'll see on the bottom right of the slide, the fish toxicity report. One of our customers asked us to have that done. And what they do is they put abrasive in water and they put fish in the water for a period of time, and then they see how many of the fish survive. Passing is if more than 50% of the fish survive, and we had 0 fatalities. At first, we didn't know that that was a big deal, but the lab told us that that almost never happens. There are some fish always die, but it didn't happen with 10X. Not everybody understands what a monograph from the International Agency for Research on Cancer means and how important it is. IARC is part of the World Health Organization, and what they do is if a decision or a determination about carcinogenicity is needed for a material, they will assemble working groups of experts from all over the world to review the human and animal studies that were done on those materials to see whether and at what dose or exposure level the material caused harm, caused diseases or cancer. And they look especially for evidence of tumors in those studies. There are 5 categories that goes from category 1, where they declare it to be carcinogenic in humans, to A is probably carcinogenic, to B is possibly carcinogenic. Group 3 is not classifiable as carcinogenic, and category 4 is probably not carcinogenic in humans. But you can see that IARC placed mineral wool in group 3, which makes it less toxic than pickled vegetables, wood dust, and being a barber. So the material is safe. So as I mentioned, there's monographs for thousands of materials, but there's only one for an abrasive material. There are IARC monographs for arsenic, beryllium, cadmium, and chrome 6. All of them were determined to be carcinogenic in humans, and we will review the beryllium studies in a minute. But we took this picture to give you an idea of how extensive the body of studies in the IARC review for mineral wool were. The IARC for mineral wool, which is shown in the binder on the left, is 3 times as extensive as the IARC monographs for arsenic, beryllium, cadmium, and chrome combined. And in the end, the working group unanimously placed mineral wool in group 3. There was no evidence of diseases or cancer in that huge body of studies. And I can tell you that you have a problem if you're afraid to get near the material because it'll kill you, because it's everywhere around us and it has been for over 100 years. And the reason's because it's a high-performing and safe material. It's even used to grow food that we eat at home. And I'm not kidding. This is a true story. One of our co-founders is a competitive vegetable grower, and he started setting records in the state of Colorado for large vegetable growing when he started blending 10X abrasives into his soil. The material is just remarkably free of hazardous metals, both in dry samples and wet samples. The trace metals analysis on this slide shows that beryllium was less than 3.85 parts per million or milligrams per kilogram. But we've done many tests. This is just one. It's often that low, and sometimes it's a little higher. It averages just a bit higher than that at 5.8 parts per million. For reference, the material with the lowest beryllium content that was ever shown to cause tumors in actual exposure studies was beryl ore at 5,000 to 35,000 ppm beryllium. The amount of beryllium in all abrasive materials is less than 10 ppm, which is essentially zero. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So just to give you an idea, all IARC monographs review both human studies and animal exposure studies if those studies are available. The human studies of mineral wool were extensive. They followed the medical records and monitored employees in the industry, everybody from people who worked the production line to the installers and workers who were discarding the material when they were demolishing buildings. What they found was no difference, essentially, between the exposed groups and unexposed groups of people over 50 years. But the animal exposure studies are different. They're quite valuable because they allow, one, animals, their inflammatory response to dust is very similar to what it is in humans. It's predictive in humans. And what they did in these studies, and this is why it costs so much, is they exposed animals to high doses, low to high, as much as 30 milligrams per meter cubed of respirable dust. That's the smallest dust that reaches the deep gas exchange regions of the lung. But it wasn't once or over a week. They exposed these animals from the time they were young to the time they were old for 80% of their lives, 6 hours a day, 5 days a week for 2 years. And what they found was that the lungs of the exposed animals, even at the highest exposures, were as healthy as unexposed lungs on examinations by pathologists. What they do is they start with a whole bunch of rats, and then they pull some out at 3 months. They pull another group out at 6 months. they pull another group, and they monitor what's happening in the animals over time. And at no point in the study did the lung weights increase. That is an enormous conclusion. That's where it was learned that something was going on that was helping these animals clear this dust fast enough to prevent accumulation, and it was the biosolubility. And then when they stopped exposure on some animals, particle counts rapidly decreased. There was not one treatment-related tumor observed at any point during the study. And this is just one example. There are many like this in the IARC monograph for mineral wool. This slide shows a flow chart. It's reproduced from a study by Bevan. It's a 2018 publication that sums up what the true driver of toxicity is from dusts in the lungs. And what it comes down to is whether or not the particles can be cleared by our natural defense mechanisms in the deep lung. All of the bad stuff that you see on the right in the red and purple boxes happens when particles stay in the lungs for an extended period of time. It is essentially the miracle of our immune systems trying to keep us healthy and alive. But if the particles don't ever leave, then you start to get the fibrosis, the possibility of cancer. But if the particles are cleared, none of that happens. So the biosolubility of mineral wool and 10X abrasives makes all the difference. This material was studied with everything in it, its major components and its minor components, and shown not to cause diseases. And it's because it's cleared from the lungs quickly. So I would like to put in perspective the amount of beryllium in abrasive materials. In the IARC monograph for beryllium, if you care to get some really strong coffee and go through it, they studied beryllium compounds, the dusts of these materials, and beryllium-containing materials, and exposed animals' lungs to the dusts. The y-axis on the left shows how much beryllium on a mass percentage basis is in the material. So beryllium metal is all beryllium. So it's 100% beryllium. Beryllium oxide is about 36% by mass, and so on. The red bars indicate that exposure to the dust caused tumors in animals. The green bars show that exposure to dust did not cause tumors in animals. And then you'll see over on the right, beryl ore at 0.5% beryllium. Well, that's the minimum. There's a range. Beryl contains anywhere from a 0.5 to 3.5%. What we listed here as 0.5% to be conservative. It did cause tumors in animals. They couldn't attribute whether the cause of the tumors was beryllium or other stuff that's in an ore. I mean, ores contain crystalline silica, and ores contain all kinds of things that could be toxic in lungs. It's not clear that beryllium was the issue with beryl ore. But remarkably, these beryllium-containing alloys with the green bars contain 20,000 to 40,000 ppm of beryllium and did not cause cancer in animals. So I'm going to take everything from the beryllium copper alloy to the right and just blow up this chart and show the OSHA beryllium threshold, which in a material, not in the air, but in the material, it's 0.1%. And they say explicitly in the beryllium rule that the rule does not apply to materials that contain less than 0.1% beryllium, which is low, very low, relative to the materials that didn't cause problems in the IARC monograph for beryllium. The reason they did that is because 0.1% is an extremely low number. There's no evidence that materials are unsafe below that level. And 10X abrasives are even lower than that. And I'm going to show you a comparison of that on the next slide. If you take the level of beryllium in abrasives at less than 10 ppm, which according to studies that are out there is true, it's 4,000 times lower than some materials that did not cause harm in animals. So it's just extremely low. And then this last chart compares the OSHA threshold to abrasives. What this all comes down to is that the level of beryllium in abrasives is, for all practical purposes, 0. It's a million miles from anything that ever caused problems in actual exposure testing. So again, the next question comes, has there been controlled exposure testing of other abrasives? And the answer is yes, but nowhere near as extensively as mineral wool or any of these other materials. There were 3 studies of exposure of animal lungs to the dusts of abrasive materials. Back around 2000, there was a lot of activity in trying to identify substitutes for silica sand for use in abrasive blasting. So the National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health conducted 2 studies in 2001 and 2002. The graph on this page shows the results of those studies. They did what's called intratracheal instillation. It's essentially an injection of the respirable dusts of 10 different abrasives into the lungs of groups of 6 rats per abrasive. And then there was a control group that were injected with the saline fluid only and no dust. They did a single exposure, allowed 4 weeks of recovery, euthanized the animals, and then examined the lungs in a bunch of different ways to measure persistent inflammation, cell damage, and fibrosis. And they included silica sand because silica sand was shown to cause cell damage and fibrosis in studies identical to this prior to this study. So they wanted to compare the results of the other abrasives to silica sand. And I have on here, there's 2 lines. One is the cell damage from silica sand exposure and fibrosis from silica sand exposure. And the authors concluded that these abrasives are not non-toxic alternatives to blasting sand. They caused evidence of permanent lung damage within 1 month of a single exposure. And then in 2020, the National Toxicology Program did a follow-up study where they exposed animals by inhalation and essentially confirmed these results. They didn't include all the abrasives. They had garnet, coal slag, crushed glass, specular hematite, and I believe steel grit. But anybody who is blasting with coal slag, olivine, crushed glass, starlight, garnet, copper slag, nickel slag should be concerned. So now what I would like to do with you all is to go through the data that's been shared by our competitors in an attempt to slow us down. They are trying to scare the market that 10X contains too much beryllium, and I've heard other heavy metals, and is dangerous to use. This is the table of data that's been passed around. And what it is they did an air monitoring study where they measured the air concentration of arsenic, beryllium, cadmium, lead, and hex chrome in the air while blasting with 8 different abrasives. And you can see there that 10X was highest at 7.26 micrograms per meter cubed, which is really high. I mean, the permissible exposure limit is 0.2 micrograms per meter cubed. And there were 3 abrasives above that exposure limit and 1 just below it, but above the action level, OSHA action level of 0.1 micrograms per meter cubed. They're providing this data in a table without any context. There is no way for the recipient of this information to know whether the data is valid, whether it's accurate. They don't know how the data was collected. No information is provided. Well, we got a copy of the report and went through it in detail. So first, what is it? What constitutes good data? How is someone supposed to use data to make judgments? How do they know whether the data is valid and accurate? Well, these are some of the attributes. These are some of the things. Science is transparent. You never pass along numbers without saying how you got them. If I am given this information and I'm expected to use it, then I should be able to do what they did. I should be able to reproduce it. And there is no way that anybody can do that if the data is handed out in a table. The study should be impartial and controlled. The idea of this study that they sponsored was to determine the differences in air concentrations of these hazardous metals when you're blasting with the different abrasives. Well, there has to be some rational basis for making the comparison. It has to be controlled in some way so that comparisons are apples to apples. Some of the other requirements is that the procedures correctly follow a documented or a prescribed method. The results are evaluated and discussed for their validity and accuracy. The measurements are repeatable. If I do the same measurement 3 times in a row, I should get similar results. And if I don't, something is wrong with my procedure or something is off and the data is meaningless. You must be able to repeat measurements. And that uncertainty that results from that variability should be quantified and reported. So let's take these requirements and take a look at what they did in this study. Now, I can tell you that the authors of the study wrote a nice report. I would not be able to put this together and present this unless it was a nicely done, complete study. The problem is that the sponsor of the study wasn't sharing this with the data. Nobody's able to go through and evaluate the data that's been handed to them. This is what they did. They had the 8 abrasives. For each abrasive, they took air samples, and I'm assuming people know what an air sample is, but over on the left is an illustration. The blue box is a calibrated air pump. It essentially pulls air through that tube and through a filter cassette where whatever is in the air gets trapped on the filter, and then the clean air goes through the pump and out to the atmosphere. And the pump is set to flow at something that mimics a normal breathing rate. Essentially, if you sample for a few hours, the amount of air you collect should be similar to what a person breathes over the same time frame. You hang that filter cartridge somewhere outside of protective clothing on the blaster in his or her breathing zone. So as close to the mouth as possible on the chest or shoulder so that it's sampling what the person is breathing. And the way they did this is to run 3 samples with each abrasive, each one for 30 minutes. It was in a 10 by 10 by 10 room that was ventilated. The methods that they use, there are NIOSH methods that are followed to do the air sampling and the analysis for whatever the contaminant is that you're concerned about or want to measure. For arsenic, cadmium, and lead, they used NIOSH method 7300. And NIOSH method 7300 is perfectly valid for beryllium as well, but it uses optical emission spectrometry. They chose to use graphite furnace atomic absorption, NIOSH method 7102, for the beryllium, which in one way makes sense because graphite furnace atomic absorption is more sensitive than optical emissions. Generally speaking, has a lower quantitation limit. You can measure smaller values, but it also has a serious problem when monitoring abrasive dust. And the reason is because it detects, this gets a little sciencey, but it makes its detection at an optical wavelength of 234.9 nanometers wavelength of light. And both beryllium and iron, and there's a significant amount of iron in many of these abrasives, have intense spectral peaks at 234.9. At the end of the day, the iron can report to the detector and be mistaken for beryllium. And it would tend to inflate the results unless the analyst knows this could happen and carefully assesses and corrects the result. There is no discussion in the study that this was even considered as a potential problem. I just wanted to share it with all of you. And then the rest of this is just information about how the test was conducted, its setup, and so on. So let's look at requirement number 1. requirement number one is to be transparent and to give data to people in a way that if they wanted to, they would be able to go and do it for themselves and repeat the results. And as we discussed, this table is being shared without any context at all. There's no way to know that the measurements were all made on the same basis. And the recipients left to accept the results at face value. Sharing data in this way just calls into question not only the integrity of the data, but the integrity of the people providing the data. This is just science 101. So the second requirement is impartiality and the use of controls, making sure you have an apples to apples comparison, making sure that you will be able to assess what you intended to assess when you planned the study. So the report does acknowledge that the flow rate from the abrasive blast pot into the blast line has to be controlled to make a valid comparison. And the authors also say that at the sponsor's request, the valve opening was set lowest for the sponsor's preferred abrasive, which is GMA Garnet. And this was at the sponsor's request. And the authors reported it because they have to. The metering valve setting and the flow rate of the abrasive into the line is a key variable in these studies because it determines how much abrasive the sample cassette's going to be exposed to over the time the sample's taken. The metering valve for 6 of the 7 other abrasives was set basically twice as high. And we know, because we use and help our customers use our abrasives all the time, we know what the flow rate is through an opening that large, and it's 3 to 5 times what would ever be used in the field. So right off the bat, 6 abrasives were put at a disadvantage. So this is just a bias study designed to produce a desired outcome. So the next requirement is that you follow some prescribed method and you follow it appropriately and report that you followed it appropriately. Well, the air sampling didn't comply with the methods that were used. So for beryllium, NIOSH Method 7102 requires that the filter loading be limited to 2 milligrams of total dust. So essentially, if you're going to collect more than 2 milligrams, you have to take multiple samples. It says so explicitly. The OSHA Technical Manual for Personal Air Monitoring says 2 additional things. One is to analyze the sample for loose material or filter saturation, which would be an indication that the sample is overloaded with material and is therefore invalid. It also says that there shouldn't be any large particles on the filter because they don't move with the airstream. What we're trying to do here is sample air by pulling it with a calibrated pump through a filter, and we're interested in the material that is carried with that air because that's what happens when we breathe. There are 3 published NIOSH studies that identified and quantified that sample overloading is a major problem during blasting. And they substantially overestimate exposures and invalidate the air concentration measurements. The report behind that table of data does discuss, it mentions the 2 milligram maximum, but there's no discussion that any of these checks were made on the samples. And the 4th requirement is that you check and discuss the validity and accuracy of the results. The raw material, the raw data from the laboratory that analyzed the samples is provided in an appendix in the report. And you can use that data to estimate with reasonable accuracy, easily within a factor of 10, how much mass had to be on those samples in order to get the results that they got for each abrasive. And those estimated sample masses vary from 41, these are on individual samples, to 1,400 milligrams, which means that the maximum sample mass of 2 milligrams was being exceeded every few seconds. If you take that then, that total sample mass, and divide it by the volume of air that was pulled through the filter to get an air concentration, it was as high as 300 times the OSHA permissible exposure limit for total dust. It is virtually certain that these air samples were not just a little bit overloaded, but massively overloaded and invalid. The results could be as high as 1,000 times be inaccurate and inflated by a factor of 1,000. Definitely 300. And then the last requirement is that the variability in the measurements should be checked and reported. Because they provided the raw data, we were able to look at the individual samples for each abrasive. You can calculate what's called a coefficient of variation. Coefficient of variation is the standard deviation divided by the average expressed as a percent. The higher the coefficient of variation is, the more variability there is in the data. Generally speaking, on coefficients of variations, it is just unacceptable for the coefficient of variation to be above 30%. Even 20% is high. Anything under 20% is considered good. So clearly, the procedures that were used in collecting these samples resulted in extreme variability. In fact, for Clean Blast, 10X, and Black Diamond, which had the highest air concentration values in the table, 0 is inside the 95% confidence interval. So you take the average, and it's plus or minus a statistical range called a confidence interval, and which means that the result was essentially random chance, and it could have been 0, just as likely to be 0. The other interesting fact is if you can compare two data sets and calculate what's called a p-value, and that p-value tells you whether or not you can make a statement that the two measured averages are different with statistical significance. Well, if you compare the result for 10X with any other abrasive in the study, the averages are not different with statistical significance. They could be the same because the variability in this study was way too high. And this renders this data meaningless. You cannot draw any kind of conclusion from this data. So as a parting thought, we all care deeply about safety. We want to do the best for our workers, and there's some perspective that the industry needs to have in order to really do that. I have this bullet list. Our abrasives are the only ones proven to be safe through toxicological studies. It's the only one that's been shown to be soluble and cleared from the lungs. Global authorities have said it doesn't cause lung diseases or cancer, and that includes beryllium disease, that includes silicosis. Those diseases would have shown up in 50 years of exposure studies, and they never did. The other is that the beryllium content in abrasives is essentially 0. It's not a driver of toxicity, and it wasn't a driver of toxicity in the exposure testing of the other abrasive materials. Some of those abrasives in that graph that I showed you had less than 0.01 ppm of beryllium, yet caused permanent damage in lungs, in animal lungs, within a month. And then finally, the beryllium data that's been shared by our competitors is misleading at best, certainly not transparent, but it's fraudulent at worst, because it puts the receiver in the position of having to make decisions without the proper context. And we're talking about the safety of our community here. It's unethical to provide data and information in that way. So to sum this up, in part elated to be able to talk to you today, and in part frustrated. We have developed the world's safest abrasive. Our mission is, like yours, is to do the best we can for the environment and our people. And if you share our values and you want an innovative partner, we would love to talk to you and get going today. So, Jake, I will pass it on to you.
Well, thank you, Steve. I think that was really important to get through. I will say, before we go into some of these questions, if you are a company who values the safety of your workforce above all else, we want to work with you. We want to build a long-term relationship with us. Our business is built on long-term relationships. We want to help you create more value by being more efficient, faster, of course, safer. There's no question about that now. I think that, Steve, you knocked it out of the park and really explained that. And also, the product is a game changer. It's an order of magnitude better than what else has been on the market before. And frankly, our competition doesn't want you to go and test our product. They don't want you to engage with us. If you don't engage with us, then they're winning because their messaging is essentially having the impact that they want it to. When you do engage with us, well, they don't want to compete with us. Product is patented and they can't produce it. Only we can. We developed the technology, we have the patent, and we've built a whole factory for you. So we also price it fairly where we can have a viable business, but it's not some crazy margin. It's a very good product that is available globally. Now I'm going to go into some questions. Steve, we have one question which was actually, according to the chart where silica is a control, it appears that garnet is more dangerous than silica. Can you comment on how that was done?
Yes, I can. So yes, the results for garnet were higher on the metrics associated with cell damage in the lungs compared to silica sand. In the follow-up study by the National Toxicology Program, garnet was found to be the most toxic of the abrasives studied. The study shown here on this slide, this graph, was what's called an installation. It's essentially an injection of dust in saline fluid into the deep lung. It's an accepted way to do exposure studies. It's been done for decades. It's part of the gold standard suite of toxicological tests that are done on animals. The one by the National Toxicology Program published in 2020 was not done that way. That was done by exposing the animals through their breath. And in those tests, there's a comment in there that garnet was the most toxic of the abrasives studied.
All right, thank you for that. And Steve, there's another question, which is actually about the safety of 10X and mineral wool / mineral fiber insulation. I'll stop reading this verbatim. Essentially what this person or this participant is asking us is, if mineral wool and 10X was dangerous, wouldn't we have seen issues like what happened with asbestos insulation?
That's actually an excellent question because it's pretty much the punchline. What blasters and their employers are worried about. They're worried that their workers are going to be exposed to abrasive dust and it's going to harm them. It's going to cause long-term harm in some way, shape, or form. With beryllium, the problem is chronic beryllium disease. At least that's how it starts. And then it can progress and become cancer. With silica, and by the way, beryllium and beryllium compounds are not soluble in the lungs. They stay in the lungs. And I had a conversation about this with a NIOSH researcher who published many papers that I've read, and I wanted to confirm my understanding of his research. So I asked him, is it right to say that even if someone is genetically predisposed to getting beryllium disease and they become what's called sensitized, which makes them a candidate for chronic beryllium disease, am I correct to say that even if they've already been sensitized, that they won't get chronic beryllium disease unless the particles stay in lungs? And he said, yes, that's absolutely correct. Because lung diseases don't happen if the particles are cleared. If the particles are cleared, the problem is solved. So first of all, that clearly never happened in 50 years of studies of mineral wool. Then if you talk about silicosis, it's entirely different in many ways from beryllium because it's a crystalline particle. We have virtually no crystalline content in our abrasives, but it's a crystalline particle, and the smallest ones that reach the deep lung cannot be removed. They're persistent, they stay there, they kill what are called the macrophage cells that remove them. It's a primary line of defense. It's called alveolar macrophage cells. So once a macrophage cell engulfs a crystalline silica particle, it can't manage it, and the particle is toxic to the cell. It dies, it leaches, and sets up chronic inflammation and all the other things that happen when particles stay in the lungs. So it's a different mechanism. What they share in common is that the material stays in the lungs. In fact, they have identified the observed silica beryllium particles in the lungs of people on autopsy decades after exposure. It's two things. It's the solubility of the material in the lungs, which is proven. There are many, many studies. They're still studying it today. And all mineral wool manufacturers formulate their products for solubility in the lungs. And the second punchline, the very important point, is that none of that ever surfaced in all of the studies on mineral wool. If there was too much beryllium, if there was too much silica, too much of anything, the effects would have been observed at some point, and they never were.
Steve, we have a couple more questions. I have a few questions that are all similar in regarding OSHA's beryllium rule, but one person typed in, interestingly, we have tested steel grit, 10X, garnet, other common abrasives on the NAVC QPL list. I think they mean 22262. We see no way to comply with the beryllium rule regardless of the abrasive of choice. They all show beryllium in air monitoring. And
Yes.
that's a statement. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I purposely did not go into the issues in sampling. We did last year in a webinar in August of last year. We went through it in quite a bit of detail. But what NIOSH discovered in two health hazard evaluations in the 1990s, one was at Bath Iron Works and one was at Avondale Shipyard, and they published these. They went and they did air sampling, and it was the first documentation of what's called the accumulation of inertially driven material in a sample. So we've got this filter cassette hanging on the chest of a blaster, and he's holding a nozzle, or he or she is holding a nozzle in their hand and spraying it at over 500 miles an hour with 300 CFM of air onto a surface, and the air and the abrasive is just flying all over the place between the blaster and the surface. You can turn the air pump, the sample pump, off, and you will still get hundreds of milligrams of material that just accumulates in the sample chamber because it got blown in there. And it's that extra material. This is a problem that is unique to abrasive blasting. It doesn't happen in other work environments. If a person's working around a machine all day long and they want to know, what vapors is that worker exposed to, they can hang a sample cassette on that worker, and it'll accurately measure the concentration of whatever they're concerned about in the air. In blasting, it's virtually impossible. And the problem is that the samples become so overloaded with material that there ends up, even if a material like, steel grit, steel doesn't have beryllium in it. If there's beryllium in steel, it is so low. But if there's any at all, actually garnet's a good example. Garnet has really low beryllium, something like 0.02 or 0.05 parts per million beryllium. It has other things in it, but it doesn't have beryllium. But even at that low level, there can be enough material in that sample where you get, say, a microgram in total of beryllium on that sample. And they don't measure the mass. The mass of the sample is not checked. Even though the method says don't exceed 2 milligrams, it's rarely checked. People rarely inspect the samples for loose material, for material that flew in and wasn't drawn in with the sampled air. These checks just aren't made. And what happens, virtually all samples taken during blasting are inflated significantly by orders of magnitude. And that's why you see the results for beryllium air concentration on blasters on the order of the permissible exposure limit. And the reason is because there's way too much material on that sample. It's not valid.
I think we've answered all the questions we have time for. Steve, if you have any other last thoughts, now's a great time to share them.
Well, I'll just finish by saying, if you want to know your blasters are safe, please call us.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks everyone for attending. I really appreciate everybody coming out, and be safe.